And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. Good evening. Welcome to the program. I'm Stephen Grootes. Well, we will talk transformation in banking in just a moment. And in a way, it's partly the sort of tale of transformation in South Africa. Lots of change at the junior, younger levels. Not quite so much change in the sort of top, more carpeted floors in the higher levels. And I suppose on one level, this is what you would expect. That kind of transformation takes longer. Remember, Gwede Mantashe, years and years ago, when he was Secretary General of the ANC, talking about, in his words, how long it had taken for there to be the Afrikaans CEO of a South African mining company. He used to talk about that. His point was that before, only English-speaking people had done it, and so transformation would sort of take time, was his point. I mean, I don't think he was justifying a delay, don't get me wrong, and I don't want to misquote the minister. But it is still interesting just to see how long it takes. We'll focus on that in just a moment. And within that has always been the suspicion that the banking industry is using race, bluntly treating black people and white people differently when it comes to lending money. We'll focus on that a little bit. MPs raising that in their session with the banking industry yesterday. I suppose part of it can sort of maybe perhaps be explained away as just banks treat rich people better than they treat poorer people, and in a country with the racialized inequality that we have, the consequences kind of follow. But I think there'll always be this perception. Part of it also is just a lack of knowledge about how systems work. And you can't blame people when they sort of look up and see, well, these people have money. How did they get it? Becomes the question. You see that everywhere, by the way. That's not just a South African comment. A big story in News 24 this morning was sort of their story. I think it's moved on a little bit because John Steenhuisen, the DA leader, Minister of Agriculture, gave a briefing about the NHI. They did an interview, News 24 did an interview with Marapina Ramakgopa, in which, and that seems to have been confirmed by Steenhuisen, that the ANC and the DL have reached some kind of deal on the NHI that will allow medical aids to stay. Now, I wouldn't have wanted to be the one to tell Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, the health minister, this, because he seems to have been against them. From what I understand, he seems to be fine with it. I haven't spoken to him myself, I must just say. But this is the rock. The issue of medical aids, I mean, could be the rock, the one single rock, perhaps, on which the National Coalition could founder. Just because for the DA's constituency, medical aids is something that just has to stay. We can argue whether medical aids are a good system or a bad system. Most people I know hate their medical aids, by the way. They still have them. And that sort of, you can have that argument. I do think there's another wrinkle in this, though, that we shouldn't forget, which is that both the ANC and the DA want to keep the NHI as a political issue, by which I mean the ANC wants to tell its voters, we're fighting for the NHI, and the DA wants to tell its voters, we're fighting against the NHI, and they both want to go into the local government saying, we want the NHI, and we're fighting against the NHI in 2 years' time. So it's in none of their interests for a quick solution. Do you see what I mean? This is going to keep going. It's a bit like land expropriation. This is going to keep going for some time because it's in the interests of the politicians for it to keep going. State of the Nation address tomorrow. We'll be taking it live. Of course, we'll have a special broadcast tomorrow evening. Just what would you like to hear? If the president could stand up and say one thing, and please don't say, I resign. Everybody says that when, you ask this question. But one thing that you think is in the power of the president in the current political situation to change. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, our banking industry facing more questions about race, transformation, lending practices this week. The Banking Association releasing its report about transformation in the industry. It says it's passed many of its transformation targets. For example, 48% of directors of boards of banks are black. At the junior management level of our banking industry, 90% of those people are black. But MPs still asking questions about lending practices. As you know, there have been questions. I suppose suspicions is also a good word about this for many years. Bongiwe Kunene is the Managing Director at the Banking Association of South Africa. Bongi, good evening, and thank you for your time. You know the suspicions about this, that banks are using race as a criterion when deciding who to lend money to. Are they really doing that?
No, they are not. In terms of banking practices and in terms of the law, banks cannot discriminate. They cannot say this race or this class or this gender needs to be treated in a particular way, different from another.
Okay, and you think the evidence, the numbers will all show that?
Yes, it should show that. We also provided the number of complaints that have been submitted to the NFO, the National Financial Ombuds Office. Those are 316 complaints that have been leveled against the banks that have reached them. So if this was common practice, it would be more than that. In 2023, the number was even smaller of those complaints. So there isn't any statement of truth or fact that would say that banks are discriminating against a particular class of citizens.
What do you think drives this? I mean, I made the point a moment ago, I think you would have heard it, that banks treat richer people better than they treat poorer people. With our racialized inequality, people will notice what the consequence of that is.
I would start with credit history and the information that banks use when they look at any credit application. The data points would always be better for someone who's had a bank account for longer, for someone who has borrowed in the past, for someone who has a record of what they are doing and the relationship that they had with the financial services provider. It doesn't matter the name of the institution. So all of these become the data that gets to be used in evaluating whether the loan is justified or not.
The other issue, I suppose, and it's not directly related to this, is whether banks are doing enough to help smaller businesses. And I realize each loan that banks make is a completely separate decision. There'll be criteria, there'll be systems, there'll be similarities, but each loan is different. Are you seeing a lot of money going to smaller businesses as loans to help small businesses get going?
I would say it's based on the numbers that we have. It's increasing year on year. I don't think it is enough. It is increasing year on year. And I'm saying it's not enough because it's really where you want to start is who is an SME. So if you are thinking micro enterprises, thinking informal businesses, startups, that community would be very large. And the amount of people who would be getting access to finance won't be as large as the demand is. And that's principally based on what is known about the entity that's applying and also the records that it holds. Sometimes, and this is an obligation that the banks must fulfill when they do the checks on anyone who is applying for a loan. They would need, let's say, the annual financial statements of that company. If it is a startup, they may not get those records. And sometimes you would find that the owner of the business is using their personal account also as a business account. And it would seem to anyone who is evaluating that information that this person has no record at all of doing the business. If it is a pure startup, there is nothing that says that this is a person who has knowledge of the business in terms of what is being assessed. So there are many factors against the SMEs in a formal banking application process.
You say in this report about transformation in your industry that your industry has passed some of its transformation targets, junior management, middle management, at target or breaking the target. still taking a long time at top management.
Yes, there's work to be done on reaching top management levels that are reflective of South African demographics. We draw a lot of strength in the fact that the pipeline has grown significantly. 90% of junior managers being black mean that as you go up, and if you are employing from within what you have, you've got sufficient room to draw competent talent to go through all the levels. It should be true that you are going to get more senior top managers being black by the mere fact that the talent pool has grown considerably.
Bongiwe Kunene, thank you very much indeed. Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
Well, this time tomorrow evening, you'll be hearing our special broadcast ahead of the State of the Nation address, and then the President himself from 7 o'clock. Obviously, we've seen his coalition government make all sorts of promises about helping businesses, about improving service delivery, about fixing just some of the problems that we face. Busisiwe Mavuso is the CEO at Business Leadership South Africa. Busisiwe, good evening to you. Are you expecting anything different from the President tomorrow night?
Stephen, good evening. No, nothing different. I think this has to be a consolidation exercise. That is what the President needs to emphasize on tomorrow. We've already started the year on a very strong footing. We have done a lot of work on the reform front. Load shedding is under control. Transport and logistics is on the mend. Water is receiving attention. The visa backlog has been eradicated. Both Moody's and S&P have noted the progress that we have made. We are hosting the G20, which presents its own unique opportunities. We have had a very successful activation at WEF 2 weeks ago in Davos. The alignment between business and government is quite strong, and we have set ourselves a very ambitious 3% economic growth target by the end of this year. And interestingly enough, the World Bank is upbeat about where South Africa is at the moment, and they've revised our growth outlook, citing the improvements made in energy and transport and logistics sectors. So the SONA, therefore, tomorrow is an opportunity to outline how we are going to consolidate the work needed to deliver that 3% economic growth. The business-government partnership has been quite productive, and our sole focus has been to deliver that growth. And from where we sit, there are really 5 critical areas of interest that we'd like to see the President elaborate on. It is on energy, it is on transport and logistics, it is on water, it is on the restoration of the criminal justice system, and it is on municipalities. Municipalities in the main, Stephen, because I really think that that is the weakest link at the moment, and I think that is what is really going to undermine all the efforts that we've put in as a country. The dismal financial state of many municipalities is now a serious risk to the economy. Municipalities are unable to manage their liabilities. We sit with a systemic risk that some large municipalities will simply collapse and fail to provide basic services to their residents and businesses. And we have now recognized this as a major challenge, and the President must emphasize the seriousness with which government is tackling this problem. So I think that is what, by and large, the President should be talking on, those things that we've been working on, how we consolidate them, and what does, continuing to focus on those things looks like.
I mean, I feel I have to keep making this point. Fixing local government is a political problem. It's incredibly difficult. I would suggest that because it's a political problem, it's probably harder to fix local government service delivery than it is to fix Eskom.
It's interesting because when you look at the Operation Vulindlela program this year, you would remember they've said that there are 2 main focus areas. It's going to be on local government and it's going to be on water. Now, the President should probably maybe, with the view of trying to give the country and business confidence, he should take us into his confidence and talk about the work that Operation Vulindlela is doing. Because what they are doing, they are presenting reforms, or they are putting together reforms, Stephen, that are going to enable national treasury and national government to intervene in local government. Because how these 3, national government, provincial government, and local government are operating, they are sort of like independent, federal, states, as it were, the one can intervene on the other. We know pipes are bursting, there's leaks, there isn't maintenance that is done on the water infrastructure and whatever. We know that companies are paying the city of Joburg and municipalities. Those municipalities are not paying ESCOM. They are receiving the electricity revenue and the water revenue. They are misusing that, and whatever the case is, the interventions that Operation Vulindlela is putting in place and the reforms that they are proposing and they are going to be putting in effect is that which allows the National Treasury to can actually withhold that money, of water, of electricity and whatever else that they need to withhold before paying over what is due to local government. And I think that is the one way, which gives national government control, because it is ludicrous that the country is going to be held at ransom by local government because they just refuse and they fail to do what needs to be done. So national government has to have some sense of power, or some sense of way of which to intervene, to say if we see things are going belly up, in city of Joburg, how do we intervene and ensure that the country doesn't get, rendered ineffective because of this one municipality? So maybe the president can start talking about that, and what, they're doing to try and fix that, as it were. And I understand some of these reforms are actually going to talk to, government, national government being able to intervene on who gets appointed in municipal, or in municipalities. And I think checking whether these people have got the right credentials, if they can do the job and whatever the case is. So it's interesting, what has been proposed. And I really think that it's the right step, to try and deal with the mess that we're currently sitting with from a local government perspective.
I think people often hope that there'll be a big dramatic announcement from the president at one of these things and not, a super train or something like that. But something that's realistically, politically possible that, the president believes in. And once again, I'm not getting that vibe tomorrow.
I don't think, but what big announcement is there to make, Stephen, even if they were to make big announcements? The problem of South Africa is not introducing new things. The problem of South Africa is fixing precisely what we have. It is making sure that the work that has been done, the progress that has been made, gets accelerated. It is really this consolidation exercise that I'm talking about. For instance, we know that we have sort of like gotten a handle in as far as energy generation is concerned. According to the business government plan, we're planning to bring about 4,000 megawatts into the grid. And we have a problem now from a transmission grid perspective. We need 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines, which is going to need 400 billion rands of investment. SOEs don't have that balance sheet. The FESCAS doesn't have that balance sheet. Private sector is actually going to come in and assist in as far as that is concerned. But then there's the PPPs. And remember, we've been talking about how National Treasury needs to look at how they amend Regulation 16 to enable PPPs. So if you're going to need about 400 billion rands invested on transport and logistics, and we've already started in as far as that is concerned with Barbara Creasy in December, opening up for private sector participation, so the president needs to talk to, for instance, the recommitment of accelerating the open access to rail infrastructure as part of delivering on the network statement that was published in December, because that alone could spark about 250 billion, 300, billion in investment in the rail network. So those are the kind of things that the president needs to emphasize on, to say Transnet, has been a big weak link in South Africa. What is it that we're going to do to ensure that we get to the 220 million tons, which is the capacity that industry needs Transnet to be operating at? At the moment, I think they're operating at about 157 million tons. Where are we going to be sitting at the end of the year? According to the business government partnership, we should be sitting at about 193 million tons. So what is it that we're going to do to ensure that, yes, we get to the 193 million tons and to the 220 million tons, as it were? So let's just emphasize on those things and do a consolidation exercise on those things and give clear plans, timelines on how we're actually going to achieve all these things that we keep on talking about.
Busisiwe Mavuso, thank you, CEO at Business Leadership South Africa. That speech live here tomorrow.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Chris Stewart's a portfolio manager at 91. Chris, good evening. So SAPI went from a loss into a profit in their quarterly update today and then got hammered by the market for it. Chris Stewart, good evening. Are you with us? Which we seem to have lost Chris Stewart, unfortunately, somewhere in the system. Was expecting him to respond, of course. SAPI, one of the big stories, the big Sasol update as well today. And, of course, SAPI themselves, showing that essentially they are back in profit, but still the market ending the day on the JSE down 4.76%. And that suggests that maybe the market was not happy with that at all. Also, of course, Sasol, had an update as well today. The market at first seemed to like it, seemed to cheer it, and then that lost momentum. So unfortunately, that, of course, happening today on the markets. More conversations as well around the US President Donald Trump. Not a huge amount of action in terms of tariffs. The problem, of course, is whether or not markets can believe Trump, how they assess some of what he says, and how they assess what he's really going to do. This is one of the problems, particularly after today's announcements about Gaza. You're with The Money Show, just gone 6:30.
The Money Show.
With Stephen Grootes.
Yeah, good to have you. Good to hear from you this evening on The Money Show. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Lots to talk about this evening. You heard the conversation around lending practices in banks. I don't know if you've had any experiences with banks one way or another. Well, I'm sure you have if you're listening to this program. But your sort of experience of trying to get money, trying to borrow money from them. Was it easy? Was it quick? Was it sort of clinical? Was it, difficult? Was it frustrating? Was it hurtful? I mean, all of those things would be good to hear from you this evening on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. The gold price still incredibly high at the moment, and the 2024 full-year report from the World Gold Council showing that total annual global demand for gold actually hit new highs. The council says one of the main reasons for this is because there's been strong, sustained buying by central banks. And of course, one of the sort of features of the moment is how high gold prices are. Joe Cavatoni is the market strategist for North America at the World Gold Council. Joe, a good day to you in North America. Why are so many central banks buying so much gold? What's driving this demand from them?
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's a great question and something that's actually been a trend we've been watching for 15 years. Central banks being net purchasers of gold, adding it to their reserve portfolios. They see a couple of key factors for diversifying to include gold. One includes their concerns around their homegrown inflationary concerns, global concerns around inflation. But in addition to that, they've highlighted the need for liquid instruments to diversify what they do hold, whether they're holding U.S. debt or whatever the case may be, and also concerns around political and geopolitical tensions that are on the rise. So these factors are all culminating and really pushing most of the emerging market central banks to add a lot more gold to their reserve portfolios.
So for this period, banks will be buying, but none of them are selling. They're holding on to it.
That's a good point to qualify. We track the buying and the selling of central banks through the necessary reported channels and then also enhance that information with one of our market partners, Metals Focus, to ensure that we get the total picture. So there's net purchases that we've seen, which totals just above 1,000 tons for the year of 2024. But in there, some central banks, like the Philippines as an example, may have been a net seller overall throughout the course of the year. But on average, that buying behavior has been more than the selling that we've seen.
Sure. Is it certain parts of the world? You made the point sort of emerging markets. Is it all about managing currencies in a way or just making sure you have enough of liquid instruments when you need it?
It really is an emerging market discussion, and it really is an emerging market trend. And it is about currencies, but also, again, about having a liquid instrument that you can rely on when you need it. I think we have good examples of central banks having some challenges around whether it's a political certainty on their own turf or actually even when it comes to their currency, like you just mentioned. They'll use it as a stabilizing vehicle. Rest assured that they can get the liquidity that they need from it and really use it as a time of need. Or even for that matter, in some instances, when they see the timing right, they might even take some profit and reload their portfolio with other assets that they have.
I mean, for the moment, and let's say since from probably the start of the pandemic, but maybe just after, it's clear there's a lot more uncertainty around the world. We know that, being a central banker, for example, is much harder than it's been. Recent developments in the US, statements over the last 2 weeks, etc. All of that must be driving demand. I mean, that must be one of the reasons we're seeing the prices we're seeing and the demand that you spoke about last year. In other words, we might see a lot strong demand this year too.
I couldn't agree with you more. Global, political, geopolitical uncertainty raises concerns, raises volatility in assets and risk assets in markets, and it also puts people in a very uncomfortable position to have to be on call 24 hours a day to keep track and watch what's happening in any news outlet. It's very, very challenging. So not only central banks, but global investors see that role that gold can play in your portfolio, the right kind of diversification, and it keeps the use case of central banks, but also global investors at the table looking at how gold as an allocation in their portfolio can help them stabilize and smooth out the risks that they're dealing with. And again, all of these factors have just become so much more complicated with the outlook that's come from the U.S. political situation with new President Trump, the administration being lined up to help him achieve what he's looking for. But again, it's coming rapid fire and really challenging for us to make sense of. And you have to stay on 24/7.
Gold is not just about money, value, tariffs, and the new president. It's also about jewelry. The sort of demand for money, liquid instruments, that's pushing up prices. Is that having an impact on demand for gold for jewelry?
It is, and actually as a pure consumable, large markets like China and India have seen declines in the overall consumption of gold in the form of jewelry. Pretty pronounced in China, and actually, interestingly enough, the shift in China has been away from fabrication and jewelry, maybe a bit more towards investment, but in India as well. These are the two biggest markets for jewelry consumption, and on average over the course of last year, that was down about 11% year on year. But when we see these high prices and consumers think about where they put their hand in their pocket and spend, it's jewelry that tends to show us the most where there's concern there and caution on spending. It takes time for the jewelry buyer and the fabricators to come back to the market when we have these higher prices. So we'll keep a keen eye on how it develops into 2025. But again, it's about confidence on that consumer.
I mean, all of this is knock-on effects, and especially as you'll know in our economy, gold shares still very important on the Joburg Stock Exchange. For example, all in all, it would seem, largely because of everything that's happening, this is still a good time to be a gold bug, and could be a good time to hold some of those shares, some of those counters, and be into gold for some time to come.
Gold bug, gold buyer, strategic allocator of assets that are actually risk-oriented with a need for hedging. All of it plays well into the gold discussion and the story. And on the mining side, I'd say that we had an excellent year in terms of the production that came through, grew at about a 2% rate over the course of 2024. It's a question of whether these high prices will continue to keep that production coming. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. Gold's a mainstream asset, and it's actually featuring in a lot of different walks of our lives. And actually, it's an exciting time to be in the market.
Joe Cavatoni, thank you. Market strategist for North America at the World Gold Council. Fascinating. If you've got gold mining shares, you're probably enjoying that for the moment.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025.
We're in conversation with the Gauteng Tourism Authority discussing the province's participation in the 2025 Mining Indaba, and with the African Mining Indaba underway in Cape Town. It's the pivotal event, as you know, for investors, industry leaders and mining professionals, also the meeting place for government officials and the industry as well. The Gauteng province is participating at the 2025 Mining Indaba from the 3rd to the 6th of February as part of its plans to rejuvenate its mining and manufacturing sector for sustained economic recovery and growth. The MEC for Economic Development in Gauteng is Lebogang Maile. The MEC joins us now. MEC, good evening to you, and thank you for your time on The Money Show this evening. I think there are a few concerns around the mining sector, the manufacturing sector in Gauteng. You've been at the Mining Indaba. How are you focusing on rejuvenating those sectors, and mining in particular?
Good evening, and thanks for having us. as you correctly say, mining activities have declined over a period of time in the province, but you still have about 159 mines, and about 44 of those still mining gold. But the equipment manufacturing sector, it's huge, and it's not only supplying local players, it's also supplying continental and global players. I mean, if you look at the mining equipment that they produce there, it includes things like drill rigs, crushers, conveyors, and mineral processing equipment, which is important. But they are also producing construction equipment and automotive and transport equipment. So manufacturing and these subsectors is very important for us. That's what we want to focus on amongst many other things that we're doing. And we need to understand their challenges. As we always talk to them, they raise and respond. We want to be systematic, coordinate properly, collaborate with the private sector, but most importantly, create a conducive environment for business. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Gauteng is such a rich mining heritage. That must help if you want to drive new investments. I mean, what is it? Half of all gold ever mined came from Gauteng, you know. All of that must help.
Yeah, you're right. Our economy is diversified and it has evolved over many decades and centuries. I mean, since the 1800s, when people were coming, and the reason why it's called the place of gold is because of those activities. But it has evolved and it is diversified, and it has got the characteristics of all the different sectors, whether it's primary, the secondary, or tertiary. And we want to continue consolidating it and diversifying it, look at new opportunities, new economies, and so that we can be able to increase the GDP contribution of the province in the country and enhance growth so that we can be able to create jobs and fight unemployment and poverty.
One of the other things Gauteng has is many mining companies are still headquartered here. They've got big offices here. I mean, that must be important too. It helps if you want to have a meeting about mining, you're not at the Indaba, you come to Gauteng.
Yes, certainly. A lot of them, even those with operations in other provinces, are still headquartered in Gauteng. But as you know, that even the financial sector, most of them are headquartered in Gauteng. So it makes sense for them to be next to the financial institutions, because this is one sector that requires a lot of financing and resourcing. So it's easier even for them. And that's why we want to consolidate even the financial sector and other sectors so that they are able to complement each other.
And I mean, are you finding that people are willing to accept support from you? You're trying to create better business conditions. It can be quite difficult in Gauteng sometimes just because of the general problems that we have. You think there's still a big, strong future for mining in Gauteng?
They are expecting support from us, and they are actually happy that we're raising our hands, and they actually thought that we are no longer interested. But now that we are raising our hands, actively going to them, visiting their firms, and they are very happy. I think what we need to do is to consolidate and build capacity for beneficiation more than anything else, because we've got the equipment, we've got the presence of the mining houses there. We've got the enormous industrial infrastructure, which it's not optimally utilized. So things like energy reliability have to be addressed, affordability of energy, amongst other things, provision of water and its reliability, fighting crime, corruption, and cleaning our cities, and making sure that small things like robots function and they work consistently. You've got lighting at night and all that. So it's all about implementing what we are preaching, and we don't just talk about what must happen, but make sure that what needs to happen does happen.
Thank you very much indeed. Lebogang Mahile is the MEC for Economic Development in Gauteng. The Gauteng province will be participating at the 2025 Mining Indaba from the 3rd to the 6th of February as part of its plan to rejuvenate its mining and manufacturing sector for sustained economic recovery and growth. Global investors are now seeking for futuristic solutions, and the Golden Province is perfectly positioned to leverage its industrial and mining prowess with platforms like Africa's Mining Indaba serving as a perfect mechanism to drive this network. Invest in Gauteng. Invest in South Africa's reindustrialization agenda. You're with The Money Show. It's just gone 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show.
With Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of the African Mining Indaba 2025. Good evening. Welcome to the second hour of the program. We'll be talking about what appears to be a sort of backlash in the West, at least, against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI programs, in businesses. And certainly this has sort of been led, I suppose, part of the culture wars, if you want to call it that. And Donald Trump taking office as US president is obviously going to have an impact on this kind of thing. I can't help but feel slightly different from our situation, where a lot of this is mandatory. It's the law of the land to have employment equity. We were talking about banking transformation just an hour ago. So I can't help but feel really that, I don't know if the situation that we have is very different. I'm fascinated by what's going on behind the doors in the National Coalition at the moment around the NHI. Reports this morning suggesting that peace has broken out over medical aids, and that medical aids won't be banned under the NHI legislation. It does mean the whole thing, I think, would have to go through Parliament. ANC MPs would have to vote on it. I'm sure MK and EFF MPs would vote against it, etc., etc., etc. And all sorts of things will happen from there. I did make the point earlier that I think both parties kind of want the issue. They still want to be able to campaign on it one way or another. I'm just fascinated by how it's playing out. State of the Nation address tomorrow as well. I think that, there's a sense, and if you look at the voting figures from last year, a sense maybe that people just aren't grabbed as much as they used to be by these things. And there was a time, I remember, up until around 2014 or so, when the State of the Nation address lost a little bit of shine. People were losing interest in it. Then Julius Malema went to Parliament as leader of the EFF, and everything changed, because in 2015 was the first time you had that big disruption in Parliament, and every now and then there are threats that it will happen again. 2015 was a long time ago now, and I don't know if that's nearly as effective. Well, you'll hear the speech yourself tomorrow, of course. Good to hear from you this evening on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567.
The Money Show.
Business Unusual.
Well, over the last few years, you would have heard many conversations, many companies in the US, the West, around the world, investing heavily in time and money in what are called DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It's something Donald Trump campaigned against. Now he's president in the US. There seems to almost be a backlash against it. What does it really mean, though? Advita Naidu is the Africa MD at Jack Hammer Global. Advita, good evening. Good to talk to you again. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about this in the US. I do wonder if our situation is slightly different. Our programs are much more specific about employment equity, around affirmative action, around BEE. I mean, there are similarities, but strong similarities. But are our programs a little different? They're on the same theme, heading in the same direction, but quite different for various reasons.
I think there is a big difference. I think our context is very different to the US and Europe, where we're also seeing some of these shifts. Our demographic landscape is different, as well as our history. I think our commitment to diversity down here is really baked into our legislation, isn't it? And I think as much as BEE is sometimes a bit of a blunt instrument, it's really a useful guide for how companies should be thinking about what we've typically called transformation in the past. But it's not just about hiring practices. It's about supplier diversity. It's about sustainable outreach. It's about development, and it's about empowerment. So I think tends to be kind of like one monotone elsewhere, but here it's really quite robust and quite diverse. And I think for the rest of the continent, there are some businesses operating here that are taking far more of a localized approach to operations, sometimes mandated by governments and sometimes voluntarily. But I think opting out of those at this stage would probably set them back a bit from a cost perspective, because turning a ship is quite hard.
It's interesting to watch what's happening around the world. I mean, some companies do seem to be pushing against DEI. Is it just Trump? I mean, is it just the politics? Is there a shift? Is there something else happening in these companies?
I think there are a few things. I mean, obviously, the political climate can't be ignored. We live in a world where we've seen this radical shift and rise in conservative movements that really aren't shy about criticizing DEI programs as discriminatory. And then you have Donald Trump actually calling them out as being illegal. Obviously, the fundamental misunderstanding there is that the programs are discriminatory because they think they prioritize marginalized groups, but it's more about giving marginalized groups access that they didn't have before. But I think even without the political landscape, there's also economic strain and budget cuts, and a lot of companies were already reallocating resources to initiatives that had more tangible or immediate impact on the bottom line. And then, some people think that you can't actually measure the impact of these programs. And, whether they're measuring the right things or targeting appropriately is another story. But leaders, I think, are expressing a bit of frustration over the difficulty in quantifying the success of these programs.
One of the things that will have happened in these companies, and we've seen it happen here too, but one of the things that will have happened is that these companies have workers, right? Through these programs, their workforces become much more diverse. Their CEOs, who probably still tend to look like me, will now be leading these very diverse workforces. To have any legitimacy at all, they need to show these diverse workforces that they want to work with them, they want to lead them, that they will protect them when they need it. And they can't really pull back from DEI when you lead a diverse workforce without losing your own legitimacy.
That's exactly it. I mean, it's not just about the workforce either, and about pipelining. It's also about your customer base. I mean, you can't pretend to understand your customer or your workforce if you have a fairly homogenous group making the decisions for all of them.
Well, I was going to make the point that in South Africa, we've seen examples of companies that have not had a diverse group of people in the room make mistakes. I mean, often advertising, public-facing stuff. But I mean, the sort of lesson from all of this, and you can call it whatever you want, but it does seem for the moment that a diverse leadership group makes better decisions, and that's what you want.
That's exactly it. And I think, people think about diversity as, what you can see, but actually diversity that comes from what you can see is diversity of thought, which is really such a competitive advantage. It brings you the best minds. It brings you difference of thoughts. It challenges assumptions. And, this epistemic bubble that tends to form of 10 people who look exactly the same, that doesn't give you that.
I mean, if American businesses sort of go backwards, they would lose a competitive advantage, strangely. I mean, particularly, and we forget how diverse the United States is. I mean, for the moment, it didn't look like it during the presidential election for various reasons. But if you're trying to crack the US market, you need to appeal to many, many different groups of people.
That's exactly it. I mean, the segmentation that occurs is so important, and that's what we don't see. We get, these big targeted or these big messages saying we're doing away with these DEI initiatives. And I think a lot of companies they are just being a little bit more vague about what that means. I think they are going to face some talent acquisition challenges as the competition for talent intensifies. They are going to face a couple of reputational risks because they are making these statements. And I think one of the biggest things is that they're going to have a poorer workplace culture and higher turnover rates because they are not addressing the needs of the people that they are supposed to serve.
One of the things about this is that when your company becomes more diverse, when your workforce becomes more diverse in all sorts of different ways, the culture of your company changes with it. You can't change it back. The culture is the culture.
Exactly. You can't unring the bell. And, and I think this is the thing about culture is that a lot of people think that it's words on the page. It's, it's the nice statement on the company website, but actually it's how you live and breathe your company ethos. And if these are the messages that are filtering down, that diversity is not important to us, that, we're taking away funding for certain programs because we don't believe in it, there should really be some sort of alternative in place to say, it's not that we don't value diversity, it's that maybe we have better better ways of achieving it. Maybe there are better ways for us to help people feel included.
It's interesting, the idea of alternative strategies. I mean, companies that are a bit nervous about Trump, for example, will keep their diversity, equity, and inclusion program and just call it something else.
That is, rebranding is probably something that it is going to be, but I guess it's not just the nomenclature, right? It's the policies have in many instances become over-ambitious as we have them now. They're bloated, they're a bit unrealistic. So maybe going back to first principles of emphasizing equal opportunities without the contentious, troubling terminology of DEI will help. Think more about employee engagement in that way.
I mean, I find it fascinating how business language changes all the time. I mean, DEI is the word now. It would have had different phrases before. It all means the same thing, having a diverse workforce.
Absolutely. And the thing about DEI and inclusion, and I suppose it's not just about diversity, it's about inclusion. It's about making sure that everybody has a voice, everybody feels included and that they feel that they can contribute. And the thing about, business strategy and business terminology, another thing that probably needs to happen in a rebranding is just more integrated into a core business strategy rather than treat it as a standalone initiative. Businesses actually can create diversity principles and bake it into the culture and every aspect of their the way they operate to make sure that it actually translates into something that's meaningful rather than a box-ticking exercise to say, is 50% of our exco diverse?
Sure. Advita Naidu, thank you very much indeed. Africa MD at Jack Hammer Global. Do appreciate it. I mean, just a lot to think about. Obviously, what does happen in the US does sometimes set the tone for some of the conversations that we see happening here. The point, of course, still is that our situation is quite different. The demographics are very different. The need is very different. And then also the law, crucially, is very different. Unless, of course, I suppose, the law changes through the coalition and that becomes a big argument again. I get a sense that it probably won't on balance. I mean, anything can happen in our politics, but I get a sense that maybe it won't change. 17 after 7.
The Money Show.
Consumer Ninja.
Wendy Nola, of course, is your consumer ninja, and talking about how often now you are seeing cases that look like an Elon Musk or someone like that selling financial advice turns out, in fact, to be someone else. And Wendy, I mean, you've been looking at a particular case that involves someone from KwaZulu-Natal. People lost a huge amount of money. What happened?
Yeah, Bernice of KZN got hold of me. She lost 350,000 Rand. Because she was convinced when she wrote to me, this is what struck me, Stephen, she was convinced that it actually was the actual Justin Harrison of Money Tribe that had scammed her. And she was appealing to me to spread the word and stop this terrible fraudster. And I knew immediately through the work that I do that she'd fallen for one of the many, many impersonators who latch onto a personality in the financial world that has some, had platform and are known, they're wealthy themselves and so they, are led along. And so I didn't hear from her after I said it's absolutely not Justin Harrison. I can assure you of that. It's not the real one. And I don't know what she made of that because I didn't hear back from her. But what happened to her was, and just to start with, the Money Tribe website boldly states very clearly that they offer step-by-step educational content designed to help you grow your income and achieve your financial goals. We do not engage in financial advisory services, investment activities, or any get-rich-quick schemes. Our goal is to empower individuals with knowledge, blah, blah. And any of the platforms you go on, you will see beware of impersonators. And in fact, when I put Justin Harrison into Google search, the first bunch of results that came up had the word impersonator in them with warnings and trying to, so that is huge. Anyway, so Bernice said that Justin, in inverted commas, when I say that, approached us to invest with him as he himself invests and supposedly via his TikTok and Instagram does quite well. All very believable. Well, not really, but to many people, apparently, yes. Sorry, not 350. He extorted 380,000 Rand from us with not 1 Rand return. He says he has many investors, but I do believe he is a scammer. She goes into details I'm not going to go into here, but it ended with he's now promising that our withdrawal is available, but we need to pay another 26,000 for internal revenue. The scammers always say that. And she's saying, we're not doing that because Justin Harrison has bankrupted us, and I don't use that term loosely. He needs to be taken to task, etc., etc. Please, I beg you, take on this case. And so, as I say, I told her it wasn't true, and I'm not sure that she believes me.
Sure. So, I mean...
Unfortunately.
Yeah, so I mean, how does this happen? I mean, so you give... So what happens? You end up having to give money to people. How do they end up doing it? What happens when you end up trying to, when you pass the money? You never see it again, obviously. Do we know anything about the people?
You never see it
it
again. Not really, except that they're very, very active. I managed to get hold of the real Justin Harrison, who said impersonators were a growing and deeply frustrating issue affecting influencers and public figures across social media. He says he battles with this every single day. And he's talking to a lot of other influencers and celebrities who are being impersonated. And this is the modus operandi. He says they all do the same thing or very similar. They create fake accounts that mimic Justin's and others using slight variations in the username. So instead of his, which is @MoneyTribe21, they'll use @MoneyTribes21. Most people won't notice. Or they'll put a gap in or a full stop, which people don't notice. And then they download and re-upload his videos to their fake profiles, making them appear legitimate. It's all cloned material. And then they target his followers, the cheek of it. They target his followers by sending them DMs pretending to be him. And that's what happened to Bernice. Because remember she said he in inverted commas approached her. They respond to comments on his content to lure people into private conversations. That's one thing to be very, very aware of. If that happens and the tone is off, and anyway, he doesn't do that. They promote fake investment opportunities or get-rich-quick schemes, and they've also spread onto WhatsApp and Telegram. So, and interestingly, he says some of the people who've created the impersonators, the fakers who've created, his fake Money Tribe site and his name have more followers than he does.
Sure.
I found that quite extraordinary.
Sure.
Yeah.
There are lots of things that, obviously people like him who've been impersonated have done what they can to an extent. I know, to try and get something taken off YouTube is actually quite hard to get an advert taken off YouTube. TikTok, they're a big part of this as well. Do they do anything?
No, he's actually quite fed up. He says the only way to really stop this, and I would add in tandem with spreading the word as we're doing now, so that people become more immune to falling for these fakes than they are now. He says they should be doing more about it. He said he's singled out TikTok in particular. He said he's reported it, etc. And he says they just aren't proactive about it. And until they become so, the issue will continue to harm both influencers and the unsuspecting public, because I was shocked when he shared with me that so many people like Bernice, and I'm not suggesting she would take it this far, they're desperate, they've lost money. A lot of them are older folk who haven't got any means of recouping the money, earning it. And they approach him and they want, they're upset and they can be quite aggressive. And he said he was manhandled by a private investigator not long ago. And so now he has to travel full-time with personal security for himself and his family, bodyguards to you and me. He says it's a drastic but necessary measure which has come at great personal cost to me and my family. But this is how bad it's got, Stephen. I hadn't realized that, because there are so many people who still don't. They've got to blame someone, I suppose. And so if you think it is the real Justin Harrison or the real whoever it was who was impersonated and whose advice you unwittingly took or thought you were taking, you then approach the real person because you got to vent at someone. But it's really, really out of hand. And I think I'm going to have to spend some energy. They're so hard to get hold of, but these platforms saying, come on, you have a social responsibility to do something about this. What are you going to do? More verification, etc., etc. And listen to the real influencers that can verify that it's them and pull these fakers down. They're going to pop up, as soon as you put one out, but do something, bring them down.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, you never find out who's really behind it. The social media networks do nothing. People must feel powerless. It's incredibly frustrating. And I suppose only, a stronger verification system or something like that might help. But until then, you're stuck in this position. All you can do is educate.
Educate. I want people to have these conversations around the braai, at family gatherings, on the beach, wherever you are. I think the problem, Stephen, is that people who've been caught have a measure of shame, and they're probably socially isolated. That last case I mentioned to you, which was the person, the elderly couple who fell for the Elon Musk deepfake AI so-called interview with SABC, where he said, he's going to help people invest in Bitcoin. And this couple took him in inverted commas, followed the advice, got a call, said, okay, we're going to download a Bitcoin wallet, follow our steps, we're going to download a Bitcoin wallet on your phone. And it was actually AnyDesk, remember, which is remote key logging. And the fraudster then had full control of the phone and went into the bank app.
Sure.
And emptied out their accounts and maxed out their credit cards, and they've had to sell their house. This happened recently. They had to put this elderly couple had lost their house because of falling for that. So there's the fake videos, which are, at the moment, if you've got a bit of sus, you can see they're a bit off. Never mind the message. But then you've got these impersonators who are completely cloning these accounts that look legitimate because it's the right voters and everything else. It's just a means to lure people, take them into the DMs, take them into a private WhatsApp conversation, and then extort.
Frightening.
More and more money. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't handle it.
Wendy Nolip, thank you. Consumer Ninja. Very difficult. And just a reminder, people in your family, maybe elder people perhaps, maybe younger people perhaps, you just need to warn them that this happens. You've got to be so careful about who you give money to in the end. And if, to hear Warren Ingram say it in my head as I say it to you, there's no such thing as a get-rich-quick scheme. They're all schemes. They're all lies. You've got to be so careful. You're at The Money Show. In a moment, your shapeshifter, Laduma Nkokolo. He is the founder of Makosa Africa. We'll be speaking to Laduma in a few moments. Just gone 7:30. And this evening, we're speaking to the designer, Laduma Nkokolo, the founder of Makosa. And Laduma, good evening. You were actually doing a B.Tech degree, and you were interested in particular about Xhosa initiation rites. You wrote a paper on that, about fashion and design, and that somehow translated into you winning a competition overseas. You're going to have to tell me the story, Laduma, of how that happened.
Good evening, Stephen, and thank you so much for inviting me to your show. It's been a long journey. It's been literally 15 years since I did my thesis project at the Nelson Mandela University down in Gqeberha, previously known as Port Elizabeth. I simply was very interested in Xhosa initiation, specifically the dress code, because when I was going through the ritual, I was super uncomfortable with the dress code. It didn't feel cultural enough. It didn't feel fashionable and stylish enough. And so I decided for my thesis project to base my question that is based on design on whether couldn't it be explored how Xhosa initiation dress code could be modernized and brought into a modern appeal that would attract young people that would be going through the initiation process.
It's quite a brave thing to do, if I may say, Laduma, and I don't speak from a position of great knowledge. The reason I say that is you're talking about something that's been happening for hundreds of years, very old practice, and you're saying to some of the people in it who are often older than you and I, we should change it to do this. And you often get a response to that, and here you are doing it academically, nochal. I mean, I imagine it was possibly whoever was marking it, the groups of people marking it, had probably never had a paper on this issue before.
Yes, of course. Speaking about culture and tapping in on culture is quite a vulnerable space to get into. for me, it was quite easy to touch on it because I'm part of that culture, and I grew up in a home where our late mother used to read anthropology books to us as children, as bedtime stories. So the culture was embedded already in me. But of course, I was cognizant and also aware of the fact that there might be negative comments on the project based on the historical projects, such as there was a movie about initiation which didn't get great response from the public, and there was several other projects that touch on that sacred ritual. But my angle was more on the modernization and also with a bit of economic benefit to it, to create jobs. And not just that, but as a form of cultural preservation, because realistically, on a daily basis, we don't dress up in culturally connected or relatable clothing or regalia. So I saw an opportunity to establish a business that would preserve our culture on a daily basis and have ready-to-wear pieces that people can buy off the shelf, but more on a premium and luxury selling point.
Is it people who wear your products, the products that Mavuso sells, is it about making a statement? Or is it more about being comfortable in yourself? And obviously, people wear it for different reasons, but all of those things are involved, aren't they? You're wearing it to show yourself. You're wearing it to show that you're comfortable in yourself too.
Firstly, great pronunciation, Stephen. A lot of people find it super difficult to pronounce Mavuso. Anyway, people buy and wear our products for various objectives, some to make a statement, but ultimately the biggest selling point is the beauty. Culture is something that is beautiful. The Xhosa culture and many other cultures in South Africa came up with a beautiful aesthetic, and the unfortunate aspect of it that I discovered was that a lot of that beauty is preserved in museums and galleries and never goes beyond that. You only see it on Heritage Day or at traditional ceremonies. For me, that was not enough. I saw an alternative way that African people can express themselves when it comes to luxury and have an alternative choice. When people walk at the Diamond Walk, at least they know that they don't have to buy completely Eurocentric styles. Yes, they can still purchase those, but can mix with Mavuso, which carries a strong African, a strong South African, a strong Xhosa DNA. In nowadays, we do mix other aesthetics from other cultures within South Africa and the African continent at large, because if the model works with us using the Xhosa aesthetic, it can very well work with other aesthetics from other cultures as well. So people buy with the objective of expressing themselves in multiple ways, and even tourists, when they come over and buy from our store in Cape Town or at the OR Tambo store, they buying into a souvenir that would remind them of their nostalgic moments that they had in South Africa.
How did you get the label going? It's one thing to be a designer, to get a job, to sort of, sell designs or whatever it is. But to actually start a label, you need to do things. You need to get money. What was that like?
Fortunately, because I did the initial concept of the fashion brand as a thesis project, I interacted with lecturers and professors that knew very well about the potential of what I was doing. So they did a kind introduction of my brand to the Nelson Mandela innovation commercial hub. The innovation hub commercialized a lot of projects that came out of the university, where they see potential to grow the economy. And I was the first in the design arts department to work with them. And they started an incubator. I got to be mentored by someone that knew about finance. He taught me about finance. He taught me I had a separate person for production, and I had a separate person for operations. And fortunately, the time that I started the business, your social media platforms such as Facebook had already pulled a big crowd, So I took advantage of those platforms to get the name of the brand out there, and took part in local fashion shows and international fashion shows and museum exhibitions. So the brand grew traction as I implemented more activations and attended conferences and spoke about how the African aesthetic can be revolutionized in order for us Africans to get an economic benefits out of it.
Did you, have to borrow money? Did you have to draw up a business plan? I mean, some things do happen organically, and it sounds a little bit like that's what happened with you.
Yeah, of course, I had to meet the university halfway. I already had drawn up a business plan and showed them a roadmap of what my vision was. And they were kind enough to support me with resources such as they gave me 100 square meter space to operate from. And they acquired machinery, but like domestic machinery, for me to train people on how to manufacture my specific product, because it's our product is quite more complicated than you would get from any other manufacturer. And I got to explore other factories around South Africa as well, so I outsourced some of the production. And luckily, on my first month of the business, a lady by the name of Haneli Rupert came and said that, listen, I love your pieces, and I think that you're selling something that is presentable as art, and I'm going to sell it as art. She had a boutique it's still there in Cape Town in Long Street, and that's where I started selling our products for the first 8 years of the business. And after 8 years, we decided to branch out to our own retail stores that we have now, 7 of them around the country in all the major cities.
Sure. Laduma, I have to ask, is Haneli Rupert a Rupert, if you know what I mean?
Correct.
It's just wondering. All right. We're talking to Laduma Ngakolo, who is the founder of Maxoza. We're talking about the luxury market in Africa. We're talking about his journey. He's your shapeshifter this evening.
The Money Show.
Shapeshifters.
Your shapeshifter this evening, Laduma Ngakolo, the founder of Maxoza, the fashion chain. Laduma, I'm supposed to ask you questions about yourself, but I have a question about fashion firstly, and about being an African designer competing with sort of overseas designs in a way. And let me be clear, I mean kind of Western European, right? And I sometimes think there's a tendency to sort of say, if you're the African in the room, your fashion has to represent Africa and then has to fit into what Europe thinks Africa is. Do you see what I mean? I mean, is that something that you kind of face, that there's a definition that you have to live up to rather than necessarily being able to do your own thing? And from your history, you very much have your own thing in mind and you do your own thing.
Great question, Stephen. I've never felt the pressure to only focus on African aesthetic, but it just happened that I came up with something that stood out boldly, and I made it my key focus. There's a lot of designers in Africa that are on the come up. Some have been in the industry for decades, and some of them have been struggling quite a bit, to establish a strong DNA that is distinctive enough to juxtapose from the rest of the European brands. But for me, I believe that in Africa, we've got millions and billions of possibilities of how people can approach design. And those designs absolutely do not have to have patterns. They don't have to have your typical African motifs. South Africa is diverse as a continent. We've got so much possibilities just in South Africa alone. With that said, I've never felt the pressure at all. But of course, I was considering the fact that I'm based in Johannesburg, and therefore it wouldn't be easy for me to access certain opportunities. And it meant that I had to work 10 times more than a designer who's based in Paris, London, New York, because they've got all the opportunities super easy for them to reach. We still struggle to access certain things, and we haven't even scratched the surface of being known as a brand in America and in Europe. There's a lot of work that we still need to do. I feel like we've only achieved 1% of what we yet aim to achieve.
It's very interesting. Laduma the person. So we know you're from the Eastern Cape. We know that you had a very strong mom. We know that she read anthropology books to you as a child. Do you ever get a chance to relax? Do you get a chance to read books now? And I mean books for pleasure, not because you have to.
As I mentioned on the previous question, that we have to work 10 times more. So unfortunately, weekends and holidays are spent on work most of the time. Literally, this past weekend, I was doing a fashion show at the Mining Indaba, and I went there on my own. I didn't go with the team because some moments you have to really sacrifice your personal time to make sure that certain things are executed quite well. And now I'm a father to a 1-year-old and 5 months baby, so most of my downtime is spent with her if I'm not traveling.
No, well, I'm sure. And I mean, I'm not going to ask if you're getting enough sleep because I've been there and I think I know the answers. So I know how tough it is and how difficult it can be and how rewarding it is too. So do you still have the passion every day? I mean, you wake up and you think, well, I've got to design today, or I've got to do this, or I've got to do that. Do you still have the same passion that you did when you started? I mean, you certainly, Laduma, if I may say, you certainly have drive. So, I mean, that passion is still clearly driving you.
Absolutely not. I think that, when you start a business as someone that comes from the creative community, you've got two choices. I believe that you've got two choices to make. It's either you're going to stay purely the creative and only focus on the design work and the fancy stuff of the business, or you're going to wear both hats, design and running the business operations. I decided to wear both hats, and unfortunately with that means that today my head gets to blow up about tax and SARS. And the next day, what would get me out of the mood is HR, because we employ over 300 people. The next day, it's something else, So my mood basically is not basically the same every day.
Sure.
But in a circumstances such as such, one has to induce themselves in making sure that you are in good spirits every day so that you are able to create. Ideas come on a daily basis, so you cannot block them by worrying about logistics and the business operations and other things that you really cannot solve.
No, sure, I hear you. And Laduma, I mean, any advice for a young person getting into this kind of field? Obviously, work hard has got to be the big part of it, and maybe some sense of sort of mission. You were inspired by a particular thing, and that's worked out very well for you.
I'd say, other than the standard advice that one has to work hard, if you get the opportunity to study further, study as far as you can get. When I started the business, I only had the BTech degree, but then I had a desire to go and study at the best fashion school in the world. In 2014, I was fortunate enough to be granted. I took part in an international design competition, and I was granted a scholarship to go and study textiles at the best fashion school in the world in London. I achieved my master's, so that added more value to my insight. And ultimately, I would say that go into an industry or discipline that you are super passionate about and where you feel like you would serve a purpose that is far beyond money or achieving high accolades. If it wasn't for me having a sense of serving a purpose for what I do, I don't think that I would have had the same passion or drive on a daily basis about it. The sense of purpose wakes me up every day to achieve things that seem impossible.
Laduma, thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you. Laduma Ngakolo is the founder of Makosa and our shapeshifter on The Money Show tonight.